Since ancient times, simple manual devices aided people with numerical calculations. Devices have been used to aid computation for thousands of years, mostly using one-to-one correspondence with fingers. The earliest counting device was probably a form of tally stick. Later record-keeping aids throughout the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East included calculi, which were clay spheres, cones, and so on, which represented counts of items like livestock or grains. The use of counting rods is one example. The abacus was initially used for counting. The Roman version was developed from devices used in Babylonia as early as 2400 BC. Since then, many other forms of reckoning boards or tables have been invented. In the medieval European counting house, a checkered cloth would be placed on a table, and markers moved around it according to certain rules, as an aid to calculating sums of money. The Antikythera mechanism, dated to circa 100 BC, is believed to be the earliest mechanical analog computer and was designed to calculate astronomical positions. Devices of an equivalent level of complexity would not appear until 1,000 years later. Many mechanical aids to calculation and measurement were constructed for astronomical and navigational use. The planisphere was a star chart invented by Abu Rayhan al-Biruni in the early 11th century. The astrolabe was invented in either the 1st or 2nd centuries BC and is often attributed to Hipparchus. The sector, a calculating instrument used for solving problems in proportion, trigonometry, multiplication and division, and for various functions such as squares and cube roots, was developed in the late 16th century and found application in gunnery, surveying, and navigation. The planimeter was a manual instrument to calculate the area of a closed figure by tracing over it with a mechanical linkage. Early in the Industrial Revolution, some mechanical devices were built to automate long, tedious tasks, such as guiding patterns for looms. Later on in the early 20th century, more sophisticated electrical machines did specialized analog calculations. The slide rule was invented around 1620, shortly after the publication of a concept of the logarithm. It is a hand-operated analog computer for doing multiplication and division. As slide rule development progressed, added scales provided reciprocals, squares and square roots, cubes and cube roots, as well as transcendental functions such as logarithms and exponentials, circular and hyperbolic trigonometry, and other functions. Slide rules with special scales are still used for quick performance of routine calculations, such as the E6b circular slide rule used for time and distance calculations. In the 1770s, Pierre-Jacques Droz built a mechanical doll that could write holding a quill pen. By switching the number and order of its internal wheels, different letters, and hence different messages, could be produced. In effect, it could be mechanically programmed to read instructions. The tide predicting machine, invented by Sir William Thomson in 1872, was of great utility to navigation in shallow waters. It used a system of pulleys and wires to automatically calculate predicted tide levels for a set period at a particular location. The first digital electronic calculating machines were developed during World War II, followed by the first semiconductor transistors in the late 1940s and by the silicon-based transistor and monolithic integrated circuit chip technologies in the late 1950s. This led to the microprocessor and the microcomputer revolution in the 1970s. The speed, power, and versatility of computers have been increasing dramatically ever since, with transistor counts increasing at a rapid pace, as predicted by Moore's law, which states that the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit doubles about every 2 years. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first known use of the word computer was in 1613 in a book called The Young Man's Gleanings by English writer Richard Braithwaite. This usage of the term referred to a human computer, a person who carried out calculations or computations. The word continued with the same meaning until the middle of the 20th century. During the latter part of this period, women were often hired as computers. By 1943, most human computers were women. The Online Etymology Dictionary gives the first attested use of computer in the 1640s, meaning one who calculates. It states that the use of the term to mean calculating machine is from 1897. It also indicates that the modern use of the term to mean programmable digital electronic computer dates from 1937 under the name Turing machine. The differential analyzer, a mechanical analog computer designed to solve differential equations by integration, used wheel and disc mechanisms to perform the integration. In 1876, Lord Kelvin had already discussed the possible construction of such calculators, but he had been stymied by the limited output torque of the ball and disc integrators. The torque amplifier was the advance that allowed these machines to work. Charles Babbage, an English mechanical engineer and polymath, originated the concept of a programmable computer. Considered the father of the computer, he conceptualized and invented the first mechanical computer in the early 19th century. After working on his revolutionary difference engine, designed to aid the navigational calculations in 1833, he realized that a much more general design, an analytical engine, was possible. The input of programs and data was to be provided to the machine via punched cards, a method being used at the time to direct mechanical looms. For output, the machine would have a printer, a curve plotter, and a bell. The machine would also be able to punch numbers onto cards to be read in later. The engine incorporated a logic unit to control flow in the form of conditional branching and loops, and integrated memory, making it the first design for a general-purpose computer that could be described in modern terms as Turing complete. The machine was about a century ahead of its time. All the parts for this machine had to be made by hand. This was a major problem for a device with thousands of parts. Eventually, the project was dissolved with the decision of the British government to cease funding. Nevertheless, his son, Henry Babbage, completed a simplified version of the computing unit, the mill, in 1888 and gave a successful demonstration of its use in computing tables in 1906. During the first half of the 20th century, many scientific computing needs were met by increasingly sophisticated analog computers, which used a direct mechanical or electric model of the problem as a basis for computation. However, these were not programmable and generally lacked the versatility and accuracy of modern digital computers. The art of mechanical analog computing reached its zenith in the differential analyzer built by H. L. Hazen and Vannevar Bush at MIT starting in 1927, and was built on the mechanical integrators of James Thomson and the torque amplifiers invented by H. W. Nyman. A dozen of these devices were built before their obsolescence became obvious. By the 1950s, the success of digital electronic computers had spelled the end for most analog computing machines, but analog computers remained in use during the 1950s in some specialized applications. The principle of the modern computer was proposed by Alan Turing in his 1936 paper titled On Computable Numbers. Turing proposed a simple device that he called a universal computing machine, now known as the Universal Turing Machine. He proved that such a machine is capable of computing anything that is computable by executing instructions stored on a tape called programs, allowing the machine to be programmable. The fundamental concept of Turing's design is the stored program, where all the instructions for computing are stored in memory. Early computing machines had fixed programs. Changing its function required the rewiring and restructuring of the machine. This changed with the proposal of the stored program computer, which includes, by design, a program stored in memory that details the computation. In 1945, Turing joined the National Physical Laboratory and began work on developing an electronic stored program digital computer. His 1945 report, Proposed Electronic Calculator, was the first specification for such a device. John von Neumann at the University of Pennsylvania also calculated his first draft of a report on the EDVAC in 1945. The Manchester Baby was the world's first stored program computer. It was built at the Victoria University of Manchester by Frederick C. Williams, Tom Kilburn, and Jeff Tootle, and ran its first program on 21 June 1948. It was designed as a testbed for the Williams tube, the first random access digital storage device. Although the computer was considered small and primitive by the standards of its time, it was the first working machine to contain all of the elements essential to a modern electronic computer. As soon as the Baby had demonstrated the feasibility of its design, a project was initiated at the university to develop it into a more usable computer, the Manchester Mark I. Grace Hopper was the first person to develop a compiler for the programming language, which eventually became known as COBOL, and allowed the computer user to use English-like words instead of numbers to give the computer instructions. While working on a Mark II computer at Harvard University in 1947, her associates discovered a moth that was stuck in a relay, impeding its operation. The case was held as an instance of literal debugging. For many years, the term bug had been in use in engineering. In October of 1947, British catering company J. Lyons & Company decided to take an active role in promoting the commercial development of computers. The Leo 1 computer became operational on April 1951 and ran the world's first regular routine office job. From 1955 onwards, transistors replaced vacuum tubes in computer designs, giving rise to the second generation of computers. Compared to vacuum tubes, transistors have many advantages. They are smaller and require less power than vacuum tubes, so give off less heat. Transistorized computers could contain tens of thousands of binary logic circuits in a relatively compact space. However, early junction transistors were relatively bulky devices that were difficult to manufacture on a mass production basis. At the University of Manchester, a team under the leadership of Tom Kilburn designed and built a machine using a newly developed transistors instead of tubes. Their first transistorized computer, the first in the world, was operational by 1953, and a second version was completed there in April 1955. However, the machine did make use of tubes to generate its 125 kHz clock waveforms and in the circuitry to read and write on its magnetic drum memory, so it was not the first completely transistorized computer. That distinction goes to the Harwell Cadet of 1955, built by the Electronics Division of the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell. The next great advance in computing power came with the advent of the integrated circuit. The idea of an integrated circuit was first conceived by a radar scientist working for the Royal Radar Establishment of the Ministry of Defense. The first working ICs were invented by Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor. Kilby recorded his initial ideas concerning the integrated circuit in July 1958, successfully demonstrating the first working integrated examples on 12 September 1958. In his patent application, Kilby described this new device as a body of semiconductor material, wherein all the components of the electronic circuit are completely integrated. However, Kilby's invention was a hybrid integrated circuit, rather than a monolithic IC chip. Kilby's IC had external wire connections, which made it difficult to mass produce. Noyce also came up with his own idea of an integrated circuit half a year later. Noyce's invention was the first true monolithic IC chip. It solved many practical problems that Kilby's did not. Produced at Fairchild Semiconductor, it was made of silicon, whereas Kilby's chip was made of germanium. Noyce's monolithic IC was fabricated using the planar process developed by his colleague Gene Herney in early 1959. The development of the integrated circuit led to the invention of the microprocessor and heralded an explosion in the commercial and personal use of computers. While the subject of exactly which device was the first microprocessor is contentious, it is largely undisputed that the first single-chip microprocessor was the Intel 4004, designed and realized by Federico Fagan, along with Ted Hoff, Matsatoshi Shima, and Stanley Mazur at Intel. In the early 1970s, IC technology enabled the integration of more than 10,000 transistors on a single chip. System on a chip, or SoC, are complete computers on a microchip. Since ENIAC in 1945, computers have advanced enormously, with modern SoCs being the size of a coin, while also being hundreds of thousands of times more powerful than ENIAC, integrating billions of transistors and consuming only a few watts of power. The first mobile computers were heavy and ran from the mains power. The 50-pound IBM 5100 was an early example. Later portables, such as the Osborne 1 and Compact Portable, were considerably lighter, but still needed to be plugged in. The first laptops, such as the Grid Compass, removed this requirement by incorporating batteries. The same developments allowed manufacturers to integrate computing resources into mobile phones by the early 2000s. These smartphones and tablets run on a variety of operating systems and have become the dominant computing device on the market and are all powered by SoCs. Computers today have become an indispensable part of almost every aspect of daily life. The sudden loss of all computers currently in use would bring society to an almost immediate and grinding halt. Everything we do, be it personal, educational, business, travel, emergency response, everything would be almost completely crippled. We depend on computers for almost everything in our modern lives, but most of us have little or no knowledge of the technological advancements of the past that make your favorite digital device possible. Technologies that were developed in times of conflict to make the task of killing the enemy easier and more efficient. Although the development of early computers was for peaceful uses, we must never forget that it was war that drove it forward and gave us the computers we know, love, and depend on today. By World War II, the U.S. had battleships that could lob shells weighing as much as a small car over distances up to 25 miles. Physicists wrote the equations that described how atmospheric drag, Wind, gravity, muzzle velocity, etc. would determine the trajectory of the shell. But solving such equations was extremely laborious. This was the work performed by the human computers. Their results would be published in ballistic firing tables published in gunnery manuals. During World War II, the U.S. military scoured the country looking for math majors, usually female, to hire for the job of computing these tables. But not enough humans could be found to keep up with the need for new tables. Sometimes artillery pieces had to be delivered to the battlefield without the necessary firing tables, and this meant they were close to useless because they couldn't be aimed properly. Faced with this situation, the U.S. military was willing to invest in even harebrained schemes to automate this type of computation. During World War II, there were many kinds of specialized computers designed to use mechanical methods to make calculations. True airspeed calculators, firing tables, and dead reckoning computers are the most common examples. Early digital computers were electromechanical, with electric switches that drove mechanical relays to perform the calculation. These devices had a low operating speed and were eventually superseded by much faster all-electric computers, originally using vacuum tubes. By 1938, the United States Navy had developed an electromechanical analog computer small enough to use aboard a submarine. This was the torpedo data computer, which used trigonometry to solve the problem of firing a torpedo at a moving target. During World War II, similar devices were developed in other countries as well. The Z2, created by German engineer Konrad Zuse in 1939, was another one of the earliest examples of an electromechanical relay computer. In 1941, Zuse followed his earlier machine with the Z3, the world's first working electromechanical, programmable, fully automatic digital computer. The Z3 was built with 2,000 relays, implementing a 22-bit word length that operated at a clock frequency of about 5 to 10 Hz. Program code was supplied on punched film, and data could be stored in 64 words of memory or supplied from the keyboard. It was quite similar to modern machines in some respects, pioneering numerous advances such as floating point numbers rather than the harder to implement decimal system used in Charles Babbage's earlier design. Using a binary system meant that Zuse's machines were easier to build and potentially more reliable, given the technologies available at that time. Purely electronic circuit elements soon replaced their mechanical and electromechanical equivalents at the same time that digital calculation replaced analog. The engineer, Tommy Flowers, working at the Post Office Research Station in London in the 1930s, began to explore the possible use of electronics for the telephone exchange. Experimental equipment that he built in 1934 went into operation 5 years later, converting a portion of this telephone exchange network into an electronic data processing system. John Vincent Atanasoff and Clifford E. Berry of Iowa State University developed and tested the Antisoff-Berry computer, ABC, in 1942, the first automatic electronic digital computer. This design was also all electronic and used about 300 vacuum tubes, with capacitors fixed in a mechanically rotating drum for memory. During World War II, the British achieved a number of successes at breaking encrypted German military communications. The German encryption machine, Enigma, was first attacked with the help of the electromechanical bombs, which were often run by women. The British bomb was a development from a device that had been designed in Poland at the Polish Cipher Bureau by cryptologist Marian Rejewski, known as the Bomba, who had been breaking German Enigma messages for the previous 7 years using it and earlier machines. To crack the more sophisticated German Lorenz SZ4042 machine used for high-level Army communications, Max Newman and his colleagues commissioned engineer Tommy Flowers to build the Colossus. He spent 11 months from early February 1943 designing and building the first Colossus. After a functional test in December 1943, Colossus was shipped to Bletchley Park, where it was delivered on 18 January 1944 and attacked its first message on 5th of February. Colossus was the world's first electronic digital programmable computer and used a large number of vacuum tubes. It had paper tape input and was capable of being configured to perform a variety of Boolean logic operations on its data, but it was not Turing complete. 9 Mark II Colossi were built. The Mark I was converted to a Mark II, making it 10 machines in total. Colossus Mark I contained 1,500 thermonic vacuum tubes, but the Mark II with 2,400 was both 5 times faster and simpler to operate, greatly speeding the decoding process. The first program run on it was written by John von Neumann, who was comparing the efficacy of implosion and gun mechanisms to trigger the first atomic bombs. Also in 1943, the U.S. Army asked that Bell Laboratories design a machine to assist in the testing of their M9 Director, which was a type of computer that aims large guns to their targets. George Stibitz recommended a delay-based calculator for the project. This resulted in the Relay Interpolator and was later known as the Bell Labs Model 2. The ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, was the first electronic programmable computer built in the U.S. Although the ENIAC was similar to the Colossus, it was much faster, more flexible, and it was Turing complete. Like the Colossus, a program on the ENIAC was defined by the states of its patch cables and switches, a far cry from the stored program electronic machines that came later. Once a program was written, it had to be mechanically set into the machine with manual resetting of plugs and switches. The programmers of the ENIAC were 6 women, often known collectively as the ENIAC Girls. It combined the high speed of electronics with the ability to be programmed for many complex problems. It could add or subtract 5,000 times a second, 1,000 times faster than any other machine. It also had modules to multiply, divide, and square root. High-speed memory was limited to 20 words, about 80 bytes. Built under the direction of John Malchley and J. Presper Eckert at the University of Pennsylvania, ENIAC's development and construction lasted from 1943 to full operation at the end of 1945. The machine was huge, weighing 30 tons. It used 200 kilowatts of electric power and contained over 18,000 vacuum tubes, 1,500 relays, and hundreds of thousands of resistors, capacitors, and inductors. It is amazing to realize that the smartphone in your pocket uses 400,000 times less power than the ENIAC and is 1,300 times more powerful. So the next time you use that smartphone to send a text message with a funny emoji or 10, take a moment to think about the hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, military and civilian alike, who lost their lives during artillery barrages, night bombing raids, daylight bombings, and self-guided torpedoes, thanks to improved targeting systems and deadly accurate firing calculations performed by computers designed and built for the task during World War II. They were the people who suffered the pain of progress.